It's another Greatest Calls bracket interview. Very fortunate to be joined by the voice of the Auburn Tigers, Andy Burcham. And after a lot of voting, thousands of votes, couple of weeks, we have a champion on the radio side. The greatest radio call of the last 50 years, Rod Bramblett, the kick six call for Auburn back in 2013 at the Iron Bowl. Andy, of course, your dear friend, longtime voice of the Tigers for 16 years. Rod, he and his wife Paula tragically passed about a year ago in a car accident. But the first thing I want to say here is a big congratulations to you, to the Auburn community. That call is as good as it gets, well-deserved. A huge congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'll accept that on behalf of the Auburn family. It is a remarkable call from a remarkable moment in my opinion, the greatest rivalry there is, certainly in college football. And I know that there will be folks in Ann Arbor and Columbus and other places that will disagree with me there. But as far as we're concerned here, that's the best rivalry out there. And there has never been an ending to one of those Iron Bowl games like that was back in 2013.
Again, the 78th Iron Bowl, 2013, Chris Davis runs back, a missed field goal that came up short, 109 yards. Without further ado, Andy, why don't we go ahead and play this one? I was joking with you before. You probably hear this every couple hours. Forget about every couple days or every week. Here it is, the kick six call.
Chris Davis is going to drop back into the end zone in single safety. So I guess if this thing comes up short, he can field it and run it out. All right, here we go. 56-yarder. Does not have the leg. And Chris Davis takes it in the back of the end zone. He'll run it out to the 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back. He ran it back 109 yards. They're not going to keep him off the field tonight. Holy cow. Oh, my God. Auburn wins. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl in the most unbelievable fashion you will ever see. I cannot believe it. Oh my God. 34-28. And we thought a miracle at Jordan-Hare was amazing. Oh my Lord in heaven. Chris Davis just read it. 109 yards. And Auburn is going to the championship game.
You got plans next week, my friend?
Woo!
I'll be in Atlanta.
Oh my God. Never in all my days have I seen anything like that.
My friend, do you have plans for next weekend?
I'll tell you what. Last one out, turn the lights off, lock the gates, and we'll see you in Atlanta. Hey, War Eagle, everybody! 34-28. The Tigers are SEC Western Division champions, and Chris Davis is the hero. Unlikely as it may be. Tigers win 34-28.
All right, Andy, so we heard it there, the kick six call from your dear friend Rod Bramblett, voted on as the greatest radio play-by-play call of the last 50 years. We started with more than 250 radio calls in this bracket, made the bracket 68 calls. He's gotten through a bunch of powerhouses to get here. As you listen to this call for, I don't know, what is it, the millionth time you've heard it now in your lifetime over the last
at the very least, yes.
What things go through your head first as you hear that call again?
Well, the first thing that goes through my mind, and from a broadcasting standpoint, is that's his second major call in the last 2-3 games. I mean, the last two big games. I mean, he makes the call, the miracle of Jordan-Hare call against Georgia, which is just as unlikely as a field goal return for a touchdown. The big difference is it's not the final play of the game. Georgia still drove and had a chance to regain the lead in that. And then 2 weeks later, and there was a lot of buzz about that call for Rod. And then 2 weeks later, it's the Iron Bowl. Really a fun game to watch because it's a lot, it's back and forth. It's really a very good game. You think about the final play, but there's a lot of things going in. And, Auburn or Alabama gets 1 second. It looks like as you're watching it, that game has ended. We're going to overtime. And Alabama wants a shot at the field goal. They go to the replay. They put a second on the clock, and that's what sets up the greatest call, the greatest play to end a college football game, in my opinion, ever. And considering what was on the line, I mean, Alabama's going to the championship game if they win it. Instead, it's Auburn that goes to the championship game, and then that's an Auburn team that came within 13 seconds of winning a national championship a month later at the Rose Bowl. You listen to that call, and it's just so technically well. One thing, it's technically well done. He describes what happens on the play. And to his credit, he picks up Chris Davis going back to the end zone, the south end zone at Jordan-Hare Stadium, just in case something like this would happen. And so he has an idea of what could, but there's no way you know. Well, here's a little insight for you. You hear, and as Chris Davis is going down the sideline, once he gets to midfield, he just basically has to get out of everybody else's way because there's no one that's going to catch him at that point. And that's when Stan White lets loose with his "oh my gosh." And he's getting ready to say it again. And to our engineer's credit, he pots Stan down. So you just hear Rod's voice until after the play is over at that point. But it's just everything. And listen, you can watch the play, and you don't see all the blocks that take place. You don't realize until it happens that Alabama has a bunch of linemen on the field. They don't have outstanding athletes that can run after someone like Chris Davis to get him. How close Chris Davis comes to going out of bounds on that Auburn sideline. It was pretty close. And yet he didn't. And Auburn wins that game against Alabama. As much as Auburn fans get a kick out of it, Alabama folks must just roll their eyes every time that comes up, and it's never going away. It is never going away.
One thing that I think of too, as far as the kick six call and connecting it to the prayer at Jordan-Hare, and of course the call itself is a miracle at Jordan-Hare from Rod, but the fact that in the kick six call, he says, and we thought that was amazing, referring to 2 weeks ago, because who would have thought you could possibly top that? It's just the ability he had in the call 2 weeks later to remember in that moment, we just saw this, but this is times 100. That's an incredible part of it too.
Well, it's a walk-off. It's the last play, as it turns out. It's the last play of the game. And you know what? You see that in baseball a lot. You even see last-second shots in basketball more. You don't see many walk-off plays in football for whatever reason. So the fact that the game ends when he crosses the goal, when Chris Davis crosses the goal line, makes it even more remarkable. And it happens at Auburn. And it happens against Alabama. And it happens on a returned field goal, not a punt or a kickoff return. It's a field goal return, officially for 100 yards. It's not 109 yards, it's 100 yards, although he won 109 yards total in the run. That's to me what makes that play all the more remarkable. And Rod's call is, listen, I don't know about you, but those calls that you remember growing up, rooting for whatever team that you rooted for, I mean, if they raise chill bumps on your arm, and to me, those are the calls that you remember. And to this day, listening to Rod make that call, I still get chill bumps watching that play and listening to Rod's call. And listen, Vern Lundquist had a really good call on CBS TV. Eli Gold for Alabama, his call was very good, but none is better than what Rod had for that call there.
You're typically on that broadcast. You should have been on the sideline. I know you had a commitment dealing with women's basketball, so you're calling that game. Hey, take me through it from your perspective at that time. Where were you? How were you listening? And any stories behind the call for you?
I was in Las Vegas at a women's basketball tournament for Auburn. And Auburn had won the day before and was getting ready to play a really good Iowa State team in the championship game later that evening. So I watched the entire game in my hotel room. My wife had been at this tournament as well, but her flight was actually during this game. And my wife is a 2-time Auburn grad and has had season tickets longer than we've known each other. So she's trying to follow along in the plane ride from Las Vegas to Atlanta. And I'm not sure how this happened. Maybe it's divine intervention. But we are able to text each other during this game. And as it turns out, she had an Alabama fan. She was sitting, I believe, on the window, and the individual sitting next to her in the middle seat was an Alabama fan. So he's kind of following along, and they did not have TVs in the seats in front, so she couldn't watch what was going on. So she's getting her information from me somehow in a text. And I think at one time I said, well, it looks like it's going to overtime. Oh, wait a minute, 1 second left. And then I'm just trying to describe to her after the play what has just happened. And I can hear basketball players screaming in the hotel because they're watching this game as well. And the Alabama fan looked at Jan, knowing what had happened or knowing what was about to happen, and he said he ran it back for a touchdown. And she said yes, and he just put his head on the tray table in front of him. But there are so many things about that. I walked down then after that game ended. We were playing the tournament in the same casino hotel. We were actually in a rodeo arena. So we didn't have to get on a bus. So I just walked down with my radio equipment to set up for the game. And I knew a couple of the officials that were working the game before me. And when I got down there, it was halftime of the game before me, and they gave me a standing ovation. That's how much that play meant to them. We're in Las Vegas at a women's basketball tournament. Here comes the radio guy for Auburn, and they're giving me a standing ovation. I had nothing to do with it.
Such a huge part of it, too, is the context behind the game, right? You're talking about, and a lot of people, I think, overlook this. People, I should say, outside the Auburn community who listen to it, they hear the call and they think how great it was, and they say, oh, well, Auburn was fourth in the country at the time. But you factor in, what did Auburn go 0-8 in SEC play the year before, and Alabama had won 2 consecutive national championships trying for that. That's rarefied air to go for a three-peat, to beat your rival, to prevent them from getting that third straight national title. Auburn, of course, had done this against Georgia. You mentioned that a couple weeks earlier. There's so many extra elements that make it that much better and that much more iconic.
Auburn won the national championship after the 2010 season, and then went through 2 years of turmoil. A couple players were killed. You mentioned the 2012 season and the turnover there, and Gene Chizik, who was the head coach for the national champions in 2010, is let go. And Gus Malzahn, who was his offensive coordinator, comes back to take over. And listen, I don't think anyone thought at the beginning of that 2013 season that would be an Auburn team that, let alone playing for a national championship, would have a chance to play for an SEC championship, just because of what you said that Alabama had done since Auburn had won the title after the 2010 season. Alabama had won 2 in a row, and they were going for a third in a row. And they might have won a third in a row had they beaten Auburn. They'd have beaten Missouri in the SEC championship game, and I think they had a real good chance to beat Florida State in the national championship game. But not on that night. That night sent Auburn to an SEC championship. Auburn's playing in 2013 with a quarterback that was a junior college transfer. He was not Cam Newton, who came in for the 2010 season. Nick Marshall was a very talented individual, very good runner, outstanding runner, was not known for his passing, and yet he put together a terrific season in 2013. And Auburn had a really good defense in 2013, and it had a young tailback that stepped up for Auburn that year. So a lot of things happened, but remember that Iron Bowl was an undefeated Alabama team against an Auburn team that had 1 loss. Auburn had lost at LSU, had a disastrous first half in Baton Rouge, came back and actually made a game of it. But Gus Malzahn told me after that he said he thought that season turned with the loss to LSU. And then Auburn won every game until that Florida State game out in Pasadena.
The call itself, as far as Auburn and the community, to this day, what that call and that moment mean to Auburn, the school, every alum who's ever been there? What does that call mean to everyone around that place?
If you ask folks that have been around Auburn for a while, what are the calls that you remember the most in your life? For the old timers, the one that first comes to their mind is punt, Bama, punt.
Auburn trying to go after it. Here's a snap. They got it. Block kick. Moves back to the 25. Picked up on the bounce at the 25-yard line. And in for a touchdown is David Langner. David Langner caught it on the bounce at about the 20 and ran it in for the score, and it is touchdown Auburn. Auburn going after it. Here's a good snap. It is blocked. It is blocked. It's caught on the run. It's caught on the run. He's going to score. David Langner. David Langner has scored, and Auburn is tied the game.
And it was another Iron Bowl. This one was at Legion Field in Birmingham, 1972. Auburn had a good team, but was very much the underdog going in to play Alabama. And an Alabama team that, quite frankly, had more talent than Auburn. And Auburn's offense really struggled in that game. But Auburn blocked 2 punts late in that game, and both punts were returned for touchdowns. So punt, Bama, punt, those 2 calls, those 2 blocked field goals were really the 2 calls that for a number of years that's what you remembered about Auburn. Then came 1982. Pat Dye's second year at Auburn, Bo over the top. And Auburn snaps a 9-year losing streak to Alabama. So Auburn had gone from that win against Alabama in 72 to the 82 game without a win. So that game is enormous for Auburn. That call is enormous for Auburn.
Nobody split. Give the ball up and over and in, I believe. Touchdown. Touchdown Auburn. Well, that was sure second effort by Bo Jackson. He just got hit behind the line of scrimmage. Everybody knew what was coming. Alabama knew what was coming. Bo Jackson just on sheer effort got it in.
And then, you can go forward. And let me talk about another call that kind of put Rod on the map. Rod and I did Auburn baseball together for 25 years. And in 1997, Auburn played at Florida State in the regional and was in the winner's bracket game against Florida State on Saturday. And this is the old regional bracket where it was just one regional, you win the regional, and you go to Omaha. And Auburn is playing Florida State. Auburn trails by 4 runs, I believe, going into the bottom of the 9th. Auburn is the home team, and that's a big key here in Tallahassee. And David Ross, who is now the manager of the Chicago Cubs, was Auburn's backup catcher that year. Auburn's first-string catcher, who's now the head coach at Samford, Casey Dunn, an All-American for Auburn, had been hit by a pitch earlier in the regional and was out for the year. So David Ross is catching. Tim Hudson, a former Auburn great on that 97 team, was on that team as at second base when Ross comes up and Auburn trails by 2 in the bottom of the 9th. And Ross fouls off a 1-2 pitch that everyone thinks is strike 3 until the ball rolls out of the catcher's glove. And then 2 pitches later, David Ross hits a walk-off home run in his hometown against the school that he grew up rooting for. And Rod is on that call, and I'm on that call.
The 2-2 pitch. Ross swings enough drive to deep left field. That one's gone. That one's gone. Auburn wins. Auburn wins. Auburn wins. Auburn wins. Auburn wins. I don't believe it, Ross. A 3-run homer. The Tigers win. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
And that's one of the great calls in Auburn athletics history. And I think from a broadcast standpoint, that put Rod on the map just a little bit. There are many others for him, but those are 3 just huge, iconic calls. And then, of course, you get to 2013, the prayer at Jordan-Hare, and then 2 weeks later, of course, the mother of them all, the kick 6 to win it.
You mentioned a few of Rod's other calls. I should mention the kick 6 call wasn't Rod's only entry in the bracket. He actually had the prayer at Jordan-Hare one as well.
All right, here we go. 4th and 18 for the Tigers. Here's your ball game. Nick Marshall stands in, steps up, going to throw downfield, just a home run ball, and it is tipped off. And Lewis got it on the deflection. Lewis is going to score. Lewis is going to score. Lewis is going to score. Touchdown Auburn. Touchdown Auburn. A miracle at Jordan-Hare. A
that one sometimes gets overlooked just because of 2 weeks later, maybe, and based on this bracket, the greatest radio play-by-play call of the last 50 years. And this thing could have we could have gone longer, and there could have been a bigger time frame where maybe I could be saying the greatest of all time is voted on by people, Andy. But that call, it's 4th and 18, like you were just saying. Auburn had to have that game because you don't get that game, then there's not as much meaning behind the win over Alabama, of course. But for Rod to go 0 to 100 the way he did, that was just remarkable. What do you remember about that one?
Well, what I remember about that is that Auburn dominated that game for 3 quarters. And Georgia makes this miraculous comeback and actually takes the lead on a controversial play. Auburn fans to this day will tell you that the Georgia quarterback did not get into the end zone when Georgia took the lead before that final play takes place. And that drive stalls. And it doesn't look good for Auburn. At least with the kick six, not the worst thing that can happen. They could win it, but if he doesn't make it, at least you're going to overtime, at that time. So this is really, it's 4th and 18 for goodness sakes. And there were safer calls to make than try to go deep to Ricardo Lewis. And by the way, to throw into double coverage. That's double coverage that gets batted up into the air. And then Ricardo's on the other side of the Georgia players as the ball comes down to him, kind of like this, kind of Willie Mays, the Willie Mays catch over the shoulder. It's a remarkable play. It might be the play we're talking about right now, if not for kick six. And then he scores that touchdown. So that's what I remember, that so many things went into that. Auburn had a big lead in that game. Georgia came back. It's 4th and 18. You've got to think that Georgia's thinking, we've done it. And if Georgia wins that, maybe Georgia goes to the SEC championship game rather than Missouri that year. I'm not quite certain. I don't remember the standings, but they'd have at least beaten Auburn that year. And then that happens, and Auburn holds on and wins the game.
So Rod knocks off Jack Buck in the final, and that's no small task. We're talking about it, and I know we've got a lot here because you're a guy who grew up in Nashville, Illinois. I know you're a longtime Cardinal fan. You grew up listening to Jack Buck, and we just saw the other night the Mark McGuire documentary, and you brought back a lot of those Jack Buck calls. But to think that Rod knocks off a guy who's your childhood idol, and here's a guy who was a longtime friend of yours, and Jack Buck, it's the call of the Kirk Gibson walk-off home run from Game 1 of the '88 World Series. So it's not necessarily a Cardinals call, but it's still Jack Buck. What does that mean to you to have that kind of matchup and to have Rod knock off one of your idols?
I could have never dreamed ever that I would vote against Jack Buck in anything until I saw this matchup. And it was a no-brainer for me. And that's nothing against Joe Buck or all of the Jack Buck fans out there. I am one of them. I grew up, as you mentioned, outside St. Louis, actually about an hour outside St. Louis, a huge Cardinals fan. And one of the reasons that I'm doing what I'm doing right now was Jack Buck, who at the time, back in the 60s, was paired with Harry Carey. That was the radio crew for the St. Louis Cardinals. Can you imagine? For me, there has been no better on the major league level than Jack Buck and Harry Carey. And then Jack Buck, after Harry Carey left, was the Cardinal voice until he can no longer do it, until his Parkinson's disease. I had one chance to meet Jack Buck. I was working in Carbondale, Illinois. This is right before I moved to Auburn, and went to St. Louis to cover the Cardinals on the night that the Cardinals clinched then the National League East against the Montreal Expos. And with the New York Mets at the ballpark that night, and the Cardinals and Mets had a series starting the next day, I believe. So the Mets were there, and had the Cardinals not won that night, the Mets would have had a chance to win the National League East playing the Cardinals in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of media there. I was in the second auxiliary media box because the Mets were in the first auxiliary media box. The Cardinals won the game, and before I went downstairs to the clubhouse to get some audio, Jack Buck was sitting in the Cardinals radio booth, the KMOX radio booth there in St. Louis, the old Busch Stadium, and he was by himself. And I've heard a story about Jack Buck, and maybe Joe can confirm this, that Jack, when he was younger, he would be the one that went down to the locker room, the clubhouse, to do post-game interviews for a clinching win. And one year, he got champagne in his eyes. Now, this is, again, it's a story that I've heard, and it really affected him. And apparently he put his foot down after he became the number one voice. Someone else was going to have to do those interviews in the clubhouse. So he's in the booth by himself. No one else in that booth. The door is open, and he goes to a commercial break, and this is the only words I ever said to Jack Buck. I said, "Mr. Buck, congratulations." And he turned around and looked at me, said, "Thank you." And that was our conversation. But to me, he's as good a radio man, not just a baseball play-by-play guy, as good a radio man as I've ever listened to, whether it be football. He did all kinds of sports, but he also did a lot of just radio work at Camo X, hosting shows, and he was always the MC for the big athletic banquets there in St. Louis. And he was just as good as there is. And he was the reason initially that I wanted to get into this business. And so I can't say it pained me to vote against Jack Buck, because when I saw the matchup, and I voted for Rod in the semifinals as well, and I saw that Kirk Gibson home run at the top of the bracket, and I'm like, I'll bet you it comes down to Rod and Jack Buck.
Gibson swings and a fly ball to deep right field. This is going to be a home run. Unbelievable! A home run for Gibson. And the Dodgers have won the game 5-4. I don't believe what I just saw. I don't believe what I just saw.
And hopefully they can commiserate about it today, right?
Well, I can give it away now. Those were the two top seeds coming in, and surely it of course came down to that being the matchup, and Rod ends up beating Jack Buck in the final. Let me ask you this too, Andy. You're a guy who's been around college football for a while. I know you just finished up your first year, of course, of calling Auburn football. As you look at some of the college football voices of your lifetime, I know we've talked about Rod in depth here, but if you look at Rod's road to the championship in this bracket, he had to get through guys like Larry Munson and his call of Run Lindsay, just a legendary golfer for Georgia. And he had to get by Joe Starkey in the Final Four. And that was one of the great matchups, I think, of the entire bracket. That one came down to the wire in terms of voting. The band on the field call. What are some of your favorite announcers and your favorite calls in college football over the years?
And I've had the opportunity, the privilege to meet some of these legendary voices like Larry Munson or Joe Starkey. I had a chance to meet him at a play-by-play retreat that IMG put on and finally put together, wait a minute, this is the guy that I've heard all those years for the play. The band is still on the field. You still hear that.
They're down to the 20. Oh, the band is out on the field. He's going to go into the end zone. He's going into the end zone. Will it count? The Bears have scored, but the bands are out on the field. There were flags all over the place.
Rod also took over for a legend at Auburn in Jim Fife.
Touchdown, Auburn!
Who had been at Auburn for a number of years, and he called all of those great 80s Auburn teams. Think about the guys that Jim Fife called at Auburn. Bo Jackson, Charles Barkley, Frank Thomas, who, of course, later went on to star for Auburn, was a freshman tight end at Auburn. But just some great Auburn teams and Auburn players. So those are guys that, and then Jim Hawthorne from just down the road, down at LSU, that Chris Blair took over for not too long ago. You have Kaywood Ledford at Kentucky. There are just so many of those great voices out there that for a generation or two of fans at those places are just, they're identified with. Let me give you another one that you may not know about. You may get a chance to meet him one day. A man that I worked for, and also Mike Kelly, who's been the longtime voice for Missouri. We both worked for a man named Mike Reese in Carbondale, Illinois, and he has called SIU Carbondale games, football, baseball, basketball, for over 40 years. And he's just one of the best that there is. A great radio man, outstanding writer. I probably learned more about everyday radio in the 4 years that I worked for Mike Reese than anyone that I've ever worked with and for. So, you've got those guys that are hugely successful and regional heroes And then there's guys like Mike that some folks may not have heard of, but nonetheless is just an outstanding play-by-play man. I mean, to this very day is an outstanding play-by-play man. So those are some of the names out there. And let me throw in one more for you. Being a St. Louis fan, I grew up listening to Dan Kelly call the St. Louis Blues. He was the Blues announcer, I think, from day one. And he was just, he was good enough that for a while he called the Stanley Cup whether the Blues were in it or not. That's how highly thought of that he was. But I grew up listening to Dan Kelly, Harry Carey, and Jack Buck. And all three of those guys now are in their respective halls of fame as well.
It's interesting you mentioned Dan Kelly. We actually had him in the bracket on the TV side for his call of the Bobby Orr goal, I think, in 1970 in the Stanley Cup Finals. So now he was one of the
against
best.
the Blues.
That was wide and Keenan cleared it but not out. Bobby Orr behind the net to Sanderson. Orr! Bobby Orr! Scores and the Boston Bruins have won the Stanley Cup.
Speaking of outstanding voices, Andy, I think we put you in that group too. I know it's, again, only your first season to call in, football in this capacity at Auburn, but had a chance to call your first Iron Bowl. I'd say it was a pretty good one for you, 48-45, a shootout win. I do have your final audio call. I wanted to play that for everyone real quick, and then we can discuss kind of what you're feeling and what it's like now to take over in the booth that your dear friend was once in. So here it is, your call, the Iron Bowl from this past year, the thrilling win over Alabama.
Nix takes the knee. This one's over. This one's over. Let the celebration begin. Get ready, Toomer's Corner. Auburn's coming to roll you. Final score, Auburn 48, Alabama 45.
Well, not a bad first Iron Bowl for you to call, 48-45. Hey, take me through what that's like calling your first Iron Bowl and getting that kind of finish.
Well, it's remarkable to get that opportunity. Let me first say that. And to have a game like that as well. A game that featured 2 pick sixes for Auburn, including one that went 100 yards by Zacoby McClain.
They throw it. It is incomplete. No, it's intercepted. Intercepted down the sideline, Tigers. Zacoby McClain, he may go the distance. One man to beat. They're not going to get him. He's to the 20, 15, 10, 5. Touchdown, Auburn! Zacoby McClain goes the distance!
Auburn gets a second back on the clock at the end of the first half and nails a 52-yard field goal as time expires. So another 1 second to play against Alabama.
Ledbetter to hold it. There's the snap. The kick is on the way by Carlson, and he made it!
And then the final drive. And Auburn had stalled a bit offensively and had Bo Nix set up as he was going to punt the ball because Alabama didn't know if Auburn was going to go for it on fourth down or if Auburn was going to punt it. And Auburn had its punter set up at wide receiver on the play. And Alabama ends up having 12 men on the field. And so they've run out of timeouts. That gives Auburn a first down. So we know at this point that Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win just as long as Auburn doesn't fumble or something disastrous happens for Auburn. Auburn's going to win that football game. So it was a fun night. It was a huge win for Auburn. And I remember after that game, and it's a long day, a home game for us. We do a 3-hour pregame show. I'm there 5 hours before kickoff. We do we tape Gus Malzahn's TV show after the game. There were folks on the field, so we kind of had to wait for folks to leave the stadium to do that. So it was a long day, and I just remember walking from Jordan-Hare Stadium to my car, which is a couple blocks away, and just thinking to myself how blessed I was to be able to be in this position in spite of the circumstances, in spite of how I was in this position. But to be in that position, to call that game, and for my first game, my first Iron Bowl game, to be that one was pretty remarkable.
As we kind of tie this all together with Rod and his kick six call, I know you've had so many people reach out and ask you about this process. I know it's not easy. I'm trying to find the words to phrase it because it's unimaginable for someone in my position or anybody to think about what you're going through, what your family's gone through. But As you think about Rod and his kick six call and the Auburn community, what's the biggest part of his legacy that people think about? What do they, when they think Rod Bramblett, what comes to mind for people first, and what comes to mind for you first?
Well, his legacy are his two children, Joshua and Shelby. Shelby is a junior at Auburn, about to become a senior, on the dean's list. Even this last year, she had straight A's in both semesters, which is remarkable. Their son lives with my wife and I. We are his guardians. One day in 2018, we had gone to dinner. We were good friends with Rod and Paula and did a lot with them. And we had gone to dinner on a Friday night before an Auburn football game. And they asked us if something should happen to them, if we would consider being the guardian of their children. So that has happened. So Joshua, who is 16 years old, just finished his sophomore year at Auburn High School, lives with us. So the legacy of Rod and Paula are those two children, those two remarkable children. For the Auburn family, it's kick six and the miracle or the prayer at Jordan-Hare, whichever you want to call it. But Rod was also a baseball guy for 25 years and called the Tim Hudsons and the David Rosses when they were at Auburn. And he was Auburn's guy he was the radio guy with the legendary Hall of Famer, Sonny Smith, that Auburn made its first Final Four appearance in basketball back in 2019.
That does it. History has been made. The Auburn Tigers, for the first time ever, are going to the Final Four. Auburn 77, Kentucky 71. The Tigers are headed to Minneapolis.
So there are a lot of things that identify with Rod, but I think the legacy are the two children.
What do you remember most about your friendship, and especially all those years spent together calling? I think you told me it was 25 years calling Auburn baseball with Rod. What do you remember most about the two of you calling games?
Well, I remember big games like the 97 Ross home run, and we got to go to a World Series together that year. But the thing I remember the most about Rod, through all those great games that we were able to call, and there were some great Auburn teams that we were able to call, was just the time we got to spend together. We were roommates on the road. We traveled all over the Southeastern Conference. That's a ton of time in a van or an SUV that you're driving with someone, typically with the sports information director for baseball in the back seat. We went through a bunch of those, but the constant was Rod and I in those two front seats. Rod always drove. And just the conversation that you have, and you get to know this person, you get to laugh together, to commiserate together, to gripe about life together, to talk about families together. So of all those things that I miss about Rod, that's the thing that I miss, is just those times together where we were going to have a good meal, whether it was in Oxford, Mississippi, or Baton Rouge or wherever, and just times together to be able to talk and to develop a long, long friendship.
The final thing I wanted to ask you here, Andy, the kick six call itself, I mentioned at the top of this, I've played it 100 times. I know guys close to me who have no affiliation to Auburn whatsoever have played it hundreds and thousands of times. Does a day go by where you can't hear that call at some point on the Auburn campus?
Well, there are some people that have that call as their ringtone on their phone, or they have it in some other, it comes up on their computer every day. If you want to see it in this day and age, you can see it every day, multiple times a day. You see it a bunch come football season, and you see it in more for Iron Bowl week. And there have been some great wins for Alabama on last-second plays, but nothing will ever, I can't imagine anything ever topping the kick six in 2013.
Well, that's Andy Burcham, the voice of the Auburn Tigers, talking about his dear friend Rod Bramblett, whose call of the kick six back at the Iron Bowl, the 78th Iron Bowl in 2013, the greatest radio play-by-play call of the last 50 years. Andy, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Again, a huge congratulations to the entire Auburn community. This is for them, and of course, this is for all the radio fans out there, but I know how much that call means. I know how much Rod meant. And I think I speak for a lot of us. All the best to you, to Jan, to Shelby, to Josh, and all of those close to you. You're an inspiration to all of us. So thank you for doing this.
My pleasure, and great work on this. I know a great deal of work went into getting all those calls together and putting that together, and I applaud you for the effort that you put in, both on the radio side and on the TV side as well.
Auburn's going to win the football game.